The ballroom glittered with the light of 1,000 candles, but the whispers that followed Grace Vance were colder than any winter night. They called her the Ashworth Charity Case, the little brown mouse, a servant in all but name, brought to the grand London affair to fetch shawls and mend torn hems. Dressed in a drab grey gown, she was a shadow amidst the vibrant silks and sparkling jewels of the ton. Lady Beatrice Ashworth and her daughters, Clara and Penelope, revelled in their casual cruelty, their laughter a sharp counterpoint to Grace's quiet dignity. But as their taunts reached a crescendo, the crowd parted. Through the sea of curious faces walked the one man no one dared to cross. Duke Andrew Beaumont, his stern gaze sweeping the room before landing, with unnerving intensity directly on her. The whispers faltered, replaced by a sudden, breathless silence. The game, it seemed, was about to change. Life for Grace Vance at Oakridge Manor was a study in practiced invisibility. She had arrived 5 years prior, a 16-year-old orphan with nothing but a small trunk of books and a name she was advised to use sparingly. Her father, Professor Alaric Vance, a brilliant but obscure academic, had passed away, leaving her in the reluctant care of his distant cousins, the Ashworths. Lord Ashworth was a man of mild temperament and even milder influence, completely governed by his wife, Lady Beatrice. It was she who had decreed Grace's station. She was not family, not truly. She was a companion, a role that sounded genteel, but in practice meant she was an unpaid, overqualified lady's maid to the Ashworth daughters, Clara and Penelope. Clara, the elder, possessed a sharp, cutting beauty and a tongue to match. Penelope was softer in appearance, but mimicked her sister's casual disdain with slavish devotion. To them, Grace was a convenient fixture, there to button the backs of their gowns, read to them when they were bored, and most importantly, serve as a constant, silent reminder of their own superior position in the world. They would often speak about her as if she weren't in the room. The mouse has quite good handwriting, I'll grant her that, Clara might say, while Grace penned invitations. A pity her face is so dreadfully plain. Grace bore it all with a quiet resilience that the sisters mistook for weakness. They did not see the sharp, analytical mind working behind her calm grey eyes. They knew nothing of the world she inhabited after they had retired for the night. In her small, draughty room in the West Wing, by the light of a single flickering candle, Grace would unroll her father's life's work, his maps. They were not ordinary maps. Alaric Vance had not been a simple academic. He was a master cartographer and strategist, a man whose work was so precise and insightful that it had, on occasion, been discreetly consulted by the War Office. His maps detailed not just coastlines and borders, but troop vulnerabilities, hidden mountain passes, and the strategic weaknesses of foreign forts. They were a legacy of genius, a treasure trove of geopolitical secrets locked away in complex ciphers and annotations that only Grace, his devoted student, could fully comprehend. Her father had once told her, "Knowledge, Grace, is the one currency that can never be stolen." At Oakridge Manor, it was the one thing that was truly hers. Her days were a monotonous cycle of service. She would rise before dawn to ensure the girls' morning gowns were pressed, endure their petty complaints during breakfast, and spend her afternoons in quiet servitude, mending lace or arranging flowers. Her only solace was the Manor's library. It was a vast, dusty room Lord Ashworth rarely entered. There, surrounded by the wisdom of ages, Grace felt a connection to her father and the life of the mind she had been forced to leave behind. She devoured books on history, politics, and science, her intellect growing sharper even as her social standing diminished. but a gnawing anxiety had begun to take root. Her father's work was too important to languish in a dusty trunk. With the growing tensions across the Channel, she knew the information contained in his maps could be vital to England's security. 6 months ago, she had painstakingly drafted a letter to the War Office, using a false name for her own protection, hinting at the existence of a valuable strategic archive left by the late Professor Vance, and inquiring how such materials might be securely delivered. She had given the letter to the Ashworth's footman to post, along with her last few shillings for postage. She never received a reply. The silence was a heavy weight, filling her with a sense of dread. Had the letter been lost? Or, far worse, had it been intercepted? Her suspicion fell squarely on Lady Ashworth, a woman who missed nothing and prized opportunity above all else. Grace could not prove it, but the thought that her father's legacy might be used as a bargaining chip by the calculating Lady Ashworth kept her awake at night, her father's warning echoing in her mind. Knowledge was a currency, yes, but in the wrong hands it was also a weapon. The air in Oakridge Manor grew thick with a feverish excitement. A formal invitation had arrived, embossed with the royal crest. The Ashworths were to attend the season's most anticipated event, the Duchess of Pembroke's annual ball in London, an affair at which members of the royal family were known to make an appearance. For Lady Beatrice Ashworth, this was not a mere social engagement. It was a battlefield. Her life's singular ambition was to see her daughters married into the highest echelons of the aristocracy. The ball was her prime opportunity. "Clara, you will wear the emerald silk. It brings out the fire in your eyes," Lady Ashworth declared, her voice sharp as she surveyed her daughters like a general inspecting her troops. "Penelope, the pale blue satin. You must look ethereal, innocent." The daughters, for their part, were consumed with a different aspect of the event. "They say the Duke of Beaumont will be in attendance," Clara whispered, a rare note of genuine excitement in her voice. "He has been in seclusion on his country estate for months. Imagine being the one to draw him out." The name hung in the air, imbued with a power that even the Ashworths had to respect. Duke Andrew Beaumont was more than just a wealthy nobleman. He was a figure of immense influence and mystique. A decorated war hero from the skirmishes on the continent, he was a trusted advisor to the king's ministers, a man known for his sharp intellect, his uncompromising principles, and his utter disdain for the frivolous games of the tongue. He was unmarried, devastatingly handsome in a severe, brooding way, and considered the greatest matrimonial prize in all of England. Lady Ashworth's eyes gleamed. "The Duke is a serious man," she mused. "He will not be swayed by a pretty face alone. He requires substance, pedigree." Her gaze flickered dismissively toward Grace, who was silently stitching a loose pearl onto Penelope's glove. The implication was clear. Substance and pedigree were qualities the Ashworths possessed, and Grace, the charity case, utterly lacked. Grace's role in the preparations was, as always, that of a phantom. She worked tirelessly, her fingers growing raw from needlework, pressing gowns until the early hours of the morning, and packing trunks with a precision the family's own maids could not match. She was to accompany them to London, of course, not as a guest, but as an attendant. "You will make yourself useful, Grace," Lady Ashworth had instructed, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Clara and Penelope will need assistance with their gowns and hair. You will remain in the background unless called upon. You are there to serve, not to socialize." As she packed, Grace's mind was far from London's ballrooms. It was on her unanswered letter. The Ashworth's trip to the city presented a sliver of an opportunity. Perhaps, if she could slip away for even an hour, she could go to the War Office herself. It was a terrifying thought. A young woman of no standing, arriving unannounced at such an imposing institution, would likely be turned away at the door. But the alternative, doing nothing, letting her father's legacy rot or be sold to the highest bidder by the likes of Lady Ashworth, was unbearable. Her resolve hardened one evening in the library. Searching for a book on naval history, she stumbled upon a folio of her father's that she had overlooked. Tucked inside was a smaller, more personal journal. In it, he wrote of his correspondence with a handful of trusted men in government. One name appeared more often than any other: Beaumont. Not as a duke, but as a young, promising Colonel Andrew Beaumont, a man her father had described as having a mind like forged steel and an integrity to match. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. Could it be the same man? The Duke? The connection seemed too improbable, a desperate fantasy. Yet her father was not a man given to idle praise. If he had trusted this Colonel Beaumont, it was for good reason. A new, desperate plan began to form in her mind. Forget the War Office. If she could somehow get a message to the Duke himself, perhaps he would understand. Perhaps he would remember the name Alaric Vance. It was a shot in the dark, a whisper against a hurricane, but it was the only hope she had. She carefully tore a blank page from the back of the journal and, with a trembling hand, began to write a new letter. This one addressed to a man she had never met. A man who held the key to everything. The Ashworths' arrival in London was a whirlwind of dress fittings and frantic social calls. They had taken a town home in Mayfair, and from the moment they arrived, Grace was run ragged. She was a ghost in the grand house, her presence acknowledged only when a service was required. Her carefully penned letter to Duke Beaumont remained hidden in the bodice of her simple dress, a secret weight against her heart. She had no means of delivering it, no way to breach the walls of servants and secretaries that surrounded a man of his stature. Their first major social test before the Duchess's ball was an assembly in the fashionable Hanover Square rooms. It was a crowded, boisterous affair, a marketplace of gossip and matrimonial manoeuvring. Lady Ashworth, flanked by her two preening daughters, entered the room with the confidence of a merchant, displaying her finest wares. Grace followed a few paces behind, carrying their shawls and fans, her eyes cast downward as instructed. She felt the familiar sting of condescending glances from other society ladies who recognized her as the Ashworths' poor relation. "Oh, look, Beatrice brought her little shadow," one woman murmured to another, loud enough for Grace to hear. "Does she ever let the poor thing have a night to herself?" Lady Ashworth simply smiled tightly, a silent acknowledgement that Grace's presence was a testament to her own supposed charity. Clara and Penelope were immediately swept into the throng of young officers and eager bachelors. Lady Ashworth began her networking, her eyes constantly scanning the room's entrances. Then a sudden hush fell over a corner of the assembly hall, a ripple of silence that quickly spread. Conversation faltered, and heads turned as one. Duke Andrew Beaumont had arrived. He was precisely as imposing as the rumors suggested, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in immaculate, severe black. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of military discipline. His dark hair was cut short, and his features were handsome, but etched with a gravity that made him seem older than his 32 years. His eyes, a startlingly clear shade of blue, missed nothing. They swept the room with a cool, assessing gaze that seemed to peel back the layers of pretense and artifice, leaving everyone feeling exposed. Lady Ashworth's heart leapt. She immediately steered her daughters toward his path, preparing her most charming smile. "Your Grace," she said, executing a perfect curtsy. "What an unexpected honor. "I am Lady Ashworth. May I present my daughters, Miss Clara Ashworth and Miss Penelope Ashworth?" The Duke inclined his head, a gesture so slight it was almost an insult. "Lady Ashworth. Miss Ashworth's." His voice was a deep, quiet baritone that carried effortlessly. He exchanged the barest of pleasantries, his expression unreadable, his gaze already moving past them. Clara tried to engage him with a flirtatious comment about the music, but he responded with a non-committal murmur, his attention clearly elsewhere. He was a man on a mission, and it was not a social one. Frustrated, Lady Ashworth guided her daughters away. "The man is made of stone," she hissed under her breath. Grace had watched the exchange from her post near a potted palm, feeling a strange mix of relief and disappointment. He was even more intimidating than she had imagined. How could she ever hope to approach such a man? As she stood there, lost in her anxious thoughts, she felt a sudden, intense pressure. It was the weight of someone's stare. She looked up, and her breath caught in her throat. Across the room, Duke Beaumont was looking directly at her. It was not a casual glance. His blue eyes were narrowed with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. There was no warmth in his expression, only a sharp, penetrating curiosity. It was as if he were trying to solve a puzzle, to place her face. For a dizzying moment, the entire crowded, noisy room seemed to melt away, leaving only the two of them. Her heart began to pound a frantic, panicked rhythm. Did he somehow know who she was? Had her father mentioned her in his letters? Just as quickly as it started, the moment was broken. A government minister approached the Duke, and he turned away, their intense connection severed. But the damage was done. Grace was unnerved, her carefully constructed invisibility shattered. More dangerously, others had noticed. Lady Ashworth's sharp eyes had caught the exchange, and her lips thinned into a line of pure fury. Clara and Penelope followed their mother's gaze, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and venom. Why would the Duke of Beaumont, the prize of the season, waste even a moment's glance on their drab little servant? To them, it was an inexplicable and unforgivable transgression. The evening, which had begun with humiliation, was now laced with a new and volatile element: jealousy. Andrew Beaumont, the 8th Duke of Beaumont, despised events like the Hanover Square Assembly. He saw them for what they were: a shallow pantomime of social climbing and empty flattery. He was there for one reason only, and it had nothing to do with finding a wife. For months, he had been engaged in a clandestine search, a mission given to him by the highest levels of His Majesty's government. He was searching for a ghost. The ghost's name was Grace Vance. The situation was critical. A long-simmering border dispute with the French in a remote colonial territory was threatening to erupt into open war. English intelligence was perilously thin, their maps of the region dangerously outdated. But Andrew knew of a collection of documents that could turn the tide, the final, unpublished work of the late Professor Alaric Vance. Andrew had known the professor years ago, before inheriting the dukedom. As a young colonel, he had been tasked with consulting Vance on matters of strategy. He had been profoundly impressed by the man's encyclopedic knowledge and his almost preternatural ability to read terrain and predict enemy movements. Vance had spoken often and with immense pride of his daughter, Grace, his brilliant protégée, who helped him with his research and ciphers. After Vance's death, his work had vanished. The War Office had made discreet inquiries, only to learn that his orphaned daughter had been sent to live with distant relatives, the Ashworths. An official letter was sent to Oakridge Manor. The reply, penned by Lady Ashworth, had been polite but firm. The girl had arrived with nothing of value, certainly no state secrets. She was a simple, uneducated creature whom they had taken in out of Christian charity. The trail had gone cold. Andrew, however, didn't believe it. He remembered Vance describing his daughter's intelligence with a father's loving pride. "She sees the patterns, Colonel," he had said. "She has the gift." This did not sound like the simple, uneducated creature Lady Ashworth described. He suspected the social climbing Lady Ashworth knew exactly what she had, and was either hiding the maps, waiting for a moment to sell them to the highest bidder, or was simply too ignorant to understand their true value. So Andrew had begun his own investigation, using his social status as a cover. His sudden re-emergence into London society was a calculated move, designed to allow him to observe the Ashworths up close. When he saw Grace standing by the wall at the assembly, it was like a lightning strike. He had never seen a photograph or a portrait of her, but he knew, with an instinct honed on the battlefield, that it had to be her. It was in her bearing. Despite her plain dress and subservient posture, there was a quiet intelligence in her eyes, a stillness that set her apart from the chattering masses. She didn't belong in the role she was playing, and it was that very incongruity that screamed the truth at him. He saw Alaric Vance's stubborn dignity in the line of her jaw. His brief, intense stare had been a test. He wanted to see her reaction. He saw not the fluttering blush of a silly girl caught by a duke's gaze, but the sharp, startled fear of a hunted animal. It confirmed his suspicion. She was hiding, and the venomous look he received from Lady Ashworth afterward confirmed the other half of his theory. She was the girl's jailer. Leaving the assembly, he immediately set his plan in motion. He sent a secret message to his most trusted agent, a man named Thomas Fleming, a former sergeant from his regiment. The instructions were simple. Find out everything you can about the companion living with the Ashworths. He also made a social call he had been dreading. He paid a visit to the home of Lord and Lady Finch, whose daughter, the ambitious Lady Isabel Finch, had been pursuing him relentlessly for years. Under the guise of polite conversation, he casually mentioned his plan to visit the countryside for some fresh air, perhaps in the vicinity of Kent, where Oakridge Manor was located. He knew the gossip would travel faster than his own carriage. He wanted the Ashworths to know he was coming. He wanted to see how they and their mysterious charge would react when the wolf arrived at their door. His hunt for the ghost was over. Now, he just had to find a way to speak to her. True to Andrew's prediction, the news of his potential visit sent Oakridge Manor into a state of utter chaos. Lady Ashworth was ecstatic, seeing it as a divine sign that her ambitions were about to be realized. The house was scrubbed, polished, and decorated within an inch of its life. Clara and Penelope were subjected to endless lectures on etiquette and conversation starters appropriate for a duke. For Grace, the news brought a wave of pure terror. Why was he coming here? Was it a coincidence? Or was it because of the look they had shared at the assembly? She clutched the letter hidden in her dress, the paper now soft and worn. His proximity made her mission both more possible and infinitely more dangerous. If Lady Ashworth caught her trying to communicate with him, the consequences would be severe. The Duke arrived on a crisp autumn afternoon, not with the grand fanfare Lady Ashworth had expected, but with a small, discreet entourage. He was gracious but formal, enduring a tour of the gardens and a tedious tea service with practiced patience. His eyes, however, were constantly searching. He noted Grace's absence immediately. Lady Ashworth, wanting to keep her prized jewel separate from her charity case, had confined Grace to her room with a pile of mending. Andrew, a master strategist, knew a direct approach was impossible. He needed to create an opportunity. During the tour of the house, he feigned a deep interest in Lord Ashworth's collection of dreary hunting tapestries, which happened to hang in the corridor outside the library. "An impressive collection," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I confess I am something of an amateur historian. Would you mind if I perused your library for a moment? I am always intrigued by a country house collection." Lord Ashworth, flattered by the attention, readily agreed. Lady Ashworth could hardly object. The family moved on, leaving Andrew alone. This was his chance. Grace, suffocating in her small room, had taken a risk. Believing the family and their guest were occupied in the main parlour, she had slipped down the back stairs to the library, her sanctuary. She needed a moment of peace, a moment to breathe. She was carefully examining one of her father's more complex charts, a detailed rendering of the Pyrenees, which she had hidden behind a row of dull theological texts, when the library door opened. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. It was the Duke. He closed the door quietly behind him, his presence seeming to shrink the vast, high-ceilinged room. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. The air crackled with unspoken questions. "Forgive my intrusion," he said finally, his voice low. "Lord Ashworth granted me permission to browse." His eyes, however, weren't on the books. They were on the chart in her hands. "Of course, Your Grace," Grace stammered, quickly trying to roll up the map. "I was just tidying." "There is no need," he said, taking a step closer. "That is not a common map. The projection is quite unusual. Mercator, but with azimuth hall modifications. Highly advanced." Grace's eyes widened. No one, not even her father's academic colleagues, had ever recognized the complexity of the projection so quickly. "My father designed it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Alaric Vance," Andrew stated. It was not a question. He was a great man, a patriot. The words, spoken with such simple, profound respect, broke through her carefully constructed defenses. Tears pricked at her eyes. "You knew him?" "I had the honor," Andrew confirmed, "which is why I am here. Miss Vance, I believe you are in possession of his final works, materials that are of critical importance to the Crown." The directness of his statement both terrified and relieved her. He knew. She no longer had to fight alone. "They are safe," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I have kept them hidden." "From whom?" he pressed gently. "From everyone," she replied, her gaze flicking nervously toward the door. "Lady Ashworth. She went through my father's effects when I first arrived. She said they were nothing but dusty papers and had them stored in the attic. I retrieved them in secret. I wrote to the War Office months ago, but the letter was intercepted," Andrew finished for her, his expression hardening. "I suspected as much." He took another step closer. "Your father spoke of you. He said you were the key to his work, the only one who could decipher his final annotations." Before Grace could respond, the library door burst open. Lady Ashworth stood on the threshold, her face a mask of thunderous rage. Her eyes darted from the Duke's serious expression to Grace's tear-streaked face, and finally to the half-rolled map in Grace's hands. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice shaking with fury. She directed her venom entirely at Grace. "How dare you bother His Grace? I gave you work to do. Get out of my sight this instant, you ungrateful girl. Back to your room." Grace flinched as if struck. She quickly concealed the map and, with a hurried, apologetic curtsy, fled the room, not daring to look back. Andrew turned to face Lady Ashworth, his placid demeanor gone, replaced by an arctic chill. "Lady Ashworth," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. You have an impressive collection of books, and an even more impressive collection of secrets. We will speak of this again." Without another word, he strode past her, leaving her standing amidst her precious books, her face pale with a dawning, sickening realization that she had profoundly, catastrophically miscalculated. The game she was playing was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The journey to London for the Duchess of Pembroke's ball was a silent, agonizing affair. Lady Ashworth's fury had cooled into a simmering, malevolent resentment directed entirely at Grace. The library incident had exposed a secret she had guarded for years, and she blamed Grace for the Duke's chilling change in demeanour. He had departed Oakridge Manor with the barest of civilities, his final glance at Lady Ashworth promising a reckoning. Now she saw Grace not just as a burden, but as a threat. Her revenge would be exacted not in private, but on the grandest stage imaginable. On the night of the ball, Lady Ashworth's intentions became brutally clear. While Clara and Penelope were adorned in their magnificent new gowns, Grace was given a dress that was little more than a servant's uniform, a plain, ill-fitting gown of drab, washed-out grey. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, with no ornamentation. The message was explicit. She was not a guest. She was staff. "You will stay near the ladies' retiring room," Lady Ashworth commanded, as they prepared to leave. "You will be on hand to assist any lady who requires it. Do not wander. Do not speak unless spoken to, and above all, do not draw attention to yourself." The Duchess of Pembroke's London residence was breathtaking, a palace of marble, gold leaf, and shimmering crystal chandeliers. The air hummed with the music of a string orchestra and the chatter of the most powerful people in the kingdom. Grace, standing in the shadows of a gilded archway, felt smaller and more insignificant than ever. She watched Clara and Penelope sweep into the ballroom, their jewels flashing, their laughter bright and confident. Her heart sank further when she saw Lady Isabel Finch, the Duke's most determined pursuer. Lady Isabel was a vision in crimson satin, her beauty as sharp and dangerous as shattered glass. She immediately attached herself to the Ashworth sisters, and Grace watched as the three of them put their heads together, casting venomous glances in her direction. A new, more public humiliation was being plotted. Grace tried to make herself invisible, her eyes scanning the crowd for the one face she longed to see, but the Duke was nowhere in sight. Perhaps he hadn't come. The thought filled her with a despair so profound it was almost a physical pain. Her tormentors chose their moment perfectly. A brief lull in the music drew the attention of the guests toward the center of the room. Lady Isabel, flanked by the Ashworth sisters, approached Grace, a glass of dark red wine in her hand. "Oh, the little companion," Lady Isabel said, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet space. "You look so very plain, dear. Almost like a ghost. One can hardly see you." Clara giggled. "She's not a ghost. She's a servant. Mother, isn't it time the servant fetched us some refreshments?" Lady Ashworth, watching from a short distance, gave a slight, approving nod. "I imagine serving is all she's good for," Lady Isabel continued, her smile turning cruel. "She certainly hasn't the grace for anything else." And with a deliberate theatrical stumble, she lurched forward, sloshing the entire contents of her wine glass down the front of Grace's grey dress. The dark red liquid bloomed across the fabric like a gruesome wound. A collective gasp went through the onlookers. Several people laughed. Grace stood frozen, the cold, sticky wine soaking through to her skin, the heat of 100 mocking stares burning her cheeks. "Oh my!" Lady Isabel cried with false horror. "How terribly clumsy of me. But then, you are rather in the way, aren't you? Perhaps you should go to the kitchens where you belong, You clumsy serving girl." Clara and Penelope joined in the laughter, their voices high and piercing. "Look at her, stained and silent," Penelope tittered. "What a pathetic creature." Grace's world narrowed to the scarlet stain on her dress and the sound of their derisive laughter. Humiliation washed over her, hot and suffocating. She wanted to run, to disappear, but her feet felt rooted to the marble floor. She lifted her chin, her father's words echoing in her memory. "Dignity is the one armor they can never pierce." She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. She simply met their cruel eyes with a steady, unbroken gaze. It was into this tense, merciless tableau that he walked. The crowd parted, as if by royal command. Duke Andrew Beaumont strode through the throng, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. He had seen everything from the far side of the room. He ignored the fawning nobles, ignored Lady Isabel's suddenly panicked expression, and ignored the stunned faces of the Ashworths. His eyes, blazing with a fire that made the chandeliers seem dim, were fixed only on Grace. The laughter died in an instant, choked off by the Duke's thunderous arrival. The air in the opulent ballroom grew still, the silence so absolute that the fizzing of champagne in a nearby glass sounded like a roar. Every eye was locked on the unfolding drama. Duke Andrew Beaumont stopped directly in front of Grace, his tall frame creating a protective barrier between her and her tormentors. He surveyed the scene with a sweeping, contemptuous glance. The smirking Ashworth sisters, the stunned Lady Isabel, and the garish red stain that marred the front of Grace's simple gown. His gaze softened only when it returned to Grace. She stood with her back straight, her chin high, a lone island of dignity in a sea of malice. He saw the tremor in her hands, the sheen of unshed tears in her eyes, and an emotion far deeper and more potent than strategic necessity surged through him. It was a fierce, primal instinct to protect, to defend, to champion. Lady Isabel, recovering her nerve, attempted to salvage the situation with a tinkling, nervous laugh. "Your Grace, you appear just in time to witness a comical little accident. The serving girl was clumsy and—" Silence. The word was not shouted. It was a low, resonant command, spoken with an authority that vibrated through the very floorboards. Lady Isabel's mouth snapped shut, her face paling. Andrew's attention remained on Grace. To the absolute shock of every person present, he did something no one could have predicted. The Duke of Beaumont, war hero, royal advisor, the most powerful and unapproachable man in the room, bowed. It was not a perfunctory nod, but a deep, formal bow from the waist, a gesture of profound respect, typically reserved for royalty. The collective gasp of the court was audible. He straightened slowly, his blue eyes never leaving hers. Then he gently took her right hand. It was trembling, and he could feel the damp chill of the spilled wine that had trickled down her arm. He ignored the stain. He ignored the murmurs of the crowd. Before the stunned and horrified eyes of the Ashworths, Lady Isabel, and the entire assembled aristocracy of England, he raised her hand to his lips. He did not brush it with a polite peck. He pressed a firm, deliberate kiss to the back of her hand, a gesture of fealty, of reverence, of unmistakable devotion. He held her hand for a moment longer as he straightened, turning his body just enough to address the frozen figures of Lady Isabel and the Ashworths, but his words were for the entire room. His voice was clear, cold, and carried to every corner of the ballroom. "For the benefit of those whose ignorance has led them to error," he began, his tone slicing through the silence, "allow me to make an introduction. This is not a serving girl. This is Miss Grace Vance." He let the name hang in the air for a moment before continuing. She is the sole heir and trusted collaborator of the late Professor Alaric Vance, a man whose genius in the fields of cartography and strategy has been instrumental in safeguarding the borders of this very empire. A man whose name the crown holds in the highest possible esteem. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He then turned his glacial stare directly onto Lady Ashworth, a name and a legacy that some have seen fit to conceal and disrespect for their own petty, avaricious reasons. An act that borders on treason. The word treason landed like a physical blow. Lady Ashworth swayed on her feet, her carefully constructed world crumbling into dust around her. Clara and Penelope looked as if they had been turned to stone. Lady Isabel's face was a mask of pure horror as she realized her cruel prank had just ended her social career, and possibly more. Andrew turned back to Grace, his expression softening once more. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice now gentle, for her ears alone. "Your father would be proud of the dignity with which you carry his name, and I would be honored if you would allow me to escort you from this place." Without waiting for an answer, he tucked her hand securely into the crook of his arm, turned his back on the wreckage of the Ashworths' ambitions, and began to lead her through the stunned, parting crowd. The Duke of Beaumont was leaving the most important ball of the season, and on his arm was the servant girl he had just elevated above them all. The walk from the ballroom was a blur for Grace. The shocked faces, the frantic whispers, the way the most powerful people in England shrank back as if she and the Duke were surrounded by an invisible, blazing aura. It all seemed like a dream. Andrew did not stop until they reached the cool, quiet solitude of the Duchess's private gardens. The distant music of the orchestra was a faint echo, a soundtrack to a life she was leaving behind forever. "Are you all right?" Andrew asked, his voice losing its hard edge, replaced by a genuine, deep concern. He led her to a stone bench, still holding her arm as if he feared she might vanish. Grace could only nod, her throat tight with 1,000 unsaid emotions. She looked down at her stained dress, the symbol of her humiliation, and then up at the man who had transformed it into a badge of honor. "You knew," she whispered. "You came for me." "I came for your father's legacy," he corrected gently. "But I found you, and I was not about to stand by and watch them treat Alaric Vance's daughter with such contemptible cruelty." He then revealed the full extent of his investigation. He told her about the border crisis, the desperate need for her father's maps, and his suspicions of Lady Ashworth. "It is worse than I thought," he continued, his tone grim. "My agent, Mr. Fleming, discovered something troubling. Lady Ashworth has not been merely hiding the maps. She has been in secret correspondence with an agent for the French. She was attempting to sell them, Grace, to sell England's security for a better match for her daughters." The revelation struck Grace with the force of a physical blow. The treachery was so profound, so much more wicked than she had ever imagined. Her intercepted letter to the War Office now made perfect, sickening sense. "They won't succeed," Andrew said, his hand covering hers. "Fleming has the correspondence. Lord Ashworth will be given a choice, full cooperation and a quiet, permanent retirement to the country in exchange for his wife's immunity from a hangman's noose. The Ashworth name will be ruined, but they will be spared the tower. It is more than they deserve. As for Lady Isabel and her ilk, their punishment would be social exile, a fate many in their circle considered worse than death. The Tun would never forgive them for so publicly humiliating a woman now under the direct and formidable protection of the Duke of Beaumont. A weight Grace hadn't even realized she was carrying lifted from her shoulders. The years of quiet suffering, of being made to feel worthless, were over. "And the maps?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "My father's work?" "His work will save lives, Grace," Andrew said with conviction. "And it will be managed by the person he trusted most, you. I am establishing a special cartographical commission under the direct authority of the Crown. I want you to lead it." Grace stared at him, speechless. He wasn't just offering her a rescue. He was offering her a purpose, a future that honored her past and celebrated her intellect. He was giving her back her life, a life of meaning and respect. She started, unsure how to articulate the immense gratitude swelling in her chest. "Your father told me you had a gift," Andrew said, his intense blue eyes searching her face in the moonlight. "He was right, but he neglected to mention your courage and your grace." He paused, his expression growing serious, more personal. "My search began as a matter of state, Miss Vance. I confess it has become something more." In the quiet of the London garden, under a canopy of stars, Grace Vance finally saw her future. It was not in the shadows, but in the light. It was a future of purpose, of honor, and of a shared horizon with the man who had walked through fire to find her. As his carriage arrived to take her away from that place forever, she knew she was not just leaving the Ashworths behind. She was stepping into her own legacy, hand in hand with the Duke who had recognized the Queen hidden within the servant. The carriage ride from the Duchess of Pembroke's residence was a journey through a silent, transformed world. The familiar clip-clop of the horses on the cobblestones and the soft creak of the leather seats were the only sounds inside the Duke's well-appointed carriage. Grace sat not opposite Andrew, but beside him, the warmth from his shoulder a comforting, solid presence in the darkness. The city lights flickered past the window, painting fleeting patterns on his strong, contemplative profile. The adrenaline from the ballroom had faded, leaving behind a profound sense of peace and a vulnerability she felt safe enough to embrace. "I have arranged for you to stay at Beaumont House," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to settle her very soul. "It is my London residence. It is quiet, secure, and my staff are completely discreet. You will be safe there." "You thought of everything," she murmured, her voice filled with an awe that went far beyond gratitude. He turned to look at her then, and in the dim, shifting light, his stern expression had softened into something gentle and deeply sincere. "I learned long ago, Miss Vance, that victory on the battlefield is not won in the moment of conflict, but in the planning that precedes it. I considered your rescue a matter of paramount importance. I could not afford to fail." His words framed her ordeal as a strategic campaign, yet the feeling behind them was anything but cold. He had fought for her. When the carriage finally stopped before a grand but understated townhouse in a prestigious square, a kind-faced, silver-haired woman in a housekeeper's uniform was already waiting, the front door open and warm light spilling onto the steps. "Mrs. Gable, this is Miss Grace Vance," Andrew said as he escorted Grace inside. "She is my honored guest. Please see that she has everything she needs." "Welcome to Beaumont House, Miss Vance," the housekeeper said, with a warm, genuine smile that held no pity, only respect. "Your rooms are prepared. Would you care for some tea, or perhaps a light supper?" The simple, kind question was so different from the demanding orders she was used to that Grace felt a lump form in her throat. She could only shake her head, overwhelmed. Mrs. Gable led her up a sweeping staircase to a beautiful suite of rooms decorated in soft blues and creams. A fire was crackling in the hearth, and a set of elegant nightclothes was laid out on the bed. On a chair lay a simple but beautiful morning gown of deep sapphire blue. Mrs. Gable noticed Grace's gaze fall upon the wine-stained grey dress she still wore. "We shall dispose of that, miss," she said gently. "You will have no more need of it." That night, Grace slept in a bed softer than any she had ever known, a deep and dreamless sleep free from the anxieties that had plagued her for years. She awoke the next morning to the sight of sunlight streaming through the tall windows, a soft knock at the door, heralding a breakfast tray brought by a smiling maid. After she had eaten, she bathed in the adjoining chamber and dressed in the sapphire gown. Looking at her reflection, she saw not the Ashworth's drab mouse, but a woman she barely recognized, a woman who looked poised, intelligent, and for the first time in a very long time, free. Andrew called upon her late that morning. He was shown into her private sitting room, and he carried a leather portfolio. His eyes lit up with a quiet appreciation when he saw her. "The color suits you, Miss Vance," he said, his formal address now feeling like a term of endearment. "Thank you, Your Grace." "For everything," she replied, her voice steady and clear. "First," he said, getting straight to business, "the Ashworths. I received a message this morning. Lord Ashworth has agreed to the terms. They depart for their most remote estate in Northumberland within the week. They will not trouble you or London society again." A final door to her past had closed. Grace nodded, a sense of quiet closure washing over her. "Second," he continued, opening the portfolio on the table between them. He spread out a series of official-looking documents, along with a beautifully rendered map of England. "This is the royal warrant establishing the Strategic Cartography Commission. And this," he said, tapping the map which showed a handsome estate on the coast of Kent, "is the property the Crown has allocated for its headquarters. It has ample space for archives, research, and a staff which you will personally select." He slid the primary document, bearing a royal seal, in front of her. At the top, in elegant script, were the words, "Appointing Miss Grace Vance as Director." "It is your future, Grace, if you will have it," he said, using her first name for the first time. The sound of it on his lips was both startling and wonderfully right. "Your mind and your father's legacy will be a fortress for this nation." She looked from the documents to his earnest face, her heart full to bursting. "I accept," she said. He smiled, a true, brilliant smile that transformed his entire face. "I had no doubt." He hesitated for a moment, the professional resolve in his eyes giving way to the same personal intensity she had seen in the garden. "My search for your father's work was a matter of duty. Ensuring your safety became a matter of honor. But now I find myself hoping for something more." He reached across the table, his hand covering hers where it rested on the warrant. "I wish to know the woman who leads this commission. I wish to know the woman who faced down her tormentors with a courage I have seldom seen. With your permission, Grace, I would like to formally court you. Not as a duke to his charge, but as a man who is utterly captivated by your strength and spirit." Looking at him, at the future he had laid out before her, a future of purpose, respect, and now the promise of love, Grace Vance finally understood. The kiss in the ballroom had not been an ending. It was the beginning. It had silenced a court, but it had started a conversation between their two hearts that was destined to last a lifetime. "Yes, Andrew," she said, her own smile finally breaking free, as bright as the morning sun. "I would like that very much." And so, Grace's story reminds us that true worth is not found in glittering titles or silken gowns, but in the quiet dignity of the soul and the brilliant workings of the mind. The very people who mocked her as a servant were forced to witness her rise, championed by a duke who saw past the drab grey dress to the priceless treasure within. Her triumph was not just a personal victory, it was a powerful lesson in justice, proving that cruelty and arrogance inevitably crumble before the forces of integrity and truth. The Ashworths and their allies sought to extinguish her light, but in doing so, they only made the resulting dawn, her new dawn, that much brighter for the entire world to see. What did you think of Grace's incredible journey from the shadows to the spotlight? Her story is a testament to resilience and the surprising ways life can deliver justice. If you were moved by her triumph over her tormentors, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this story with someone who loves to see the underdog win, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of karmic retribution and happily ever afters. Thank you for listening.